When his body was found after a fatal fall, the explanation came quickly. It was an accident. The case was closed. But almost no one believed it. The building stood quiet that night, the kind of silence that feels rehearsed. A luxury tower, sealed behind glass doors and polished stone, where every sound echoes longer than it should. Hallway lights hummed faintly. Cameras watched without blinking. Somewhere above the city, a young man lay broken on the ground below, his life reduced to a single line in an official report. The explanation arrived almost immediately. Alcohol. Loss of balance. A tragic fall. Simple. Efficient. Final. The kind of conclusion meant to bring closure. Yet instead of relief, it left behind a heaviness that refused to lift. For many who followed his life, his career, and his sudden death, the story felt finished too quickly, as if the last page had been torn out before anyone could read it. He was young, successful, surrounded by opportunity. To the public, he appeared to have everything a person could want. That was precisely why the word accident did not settle easily. Accidents are supposed to feel random. This one felt arranged. Not staged, not proven, but arranged in the sense that it demanded acceptance without questions. Then the fragments began to surface. A blurry video, filmed through a peephole, barely long enough to explain itself. A dim hallway. A figure moving forward. Shapes beside him. And behind them, a woman holding a phone. The image was unstable, distorted by low light and distance, yet it carried a detail that would soon eclipse everything else. A thin strap hanging from the phone. Ordinary. Forgettable. Except that it was not forgotten. Within hours, that small detail became the center of attention. Screenshots froze it in place. Comparisons multiplied. The strap was examined, enlarged, slowed down, and interpreted until it no longer belonged to the video at all. It became a symbol. Proof to some. Coincidence to others. But to everyone watching, it became impossible to ignore. Equally unsettling was what did not appear. No clear statement. No direct denial. Only silence. And silence, in moments like this, is never neutral. It expands. It absorbs suspicion. It invites imagination to do what facts cannot. Each hour without a response allowed new narratives to form, each more confident than the last. At this point, the story stopped being about a fall. It stopped being about alcohol, balance, or gravity. It became something else entirely. A question about trust. About how much people are willing to believe when the official answer conflicts with their instincts. About why certain deaths refuse to stay simple, no matter how neatly they are explained. The investigation, on paper, was complete. The file was closed. But outside those pages, a second story was already taking shape, written collectively by strangers who would never meet, bound together only by doubt. From this moment on, the story no longer belonged to investigators or reports. It belonged to the watchers. The ones who paused the video. The ones who noticed the strap. The ones who could not accept that nothing more had happened. And sometimes the most dangerous thing is not what we see, but what no one says. In the days that followed the announcement, the official explanation settled into place with practiced certainty. Reports repeated the same language. Alcohol consumption. Loss of balance. No signs of foul play. On paper, the logic was sound. Falls from height are unforgiving. Gravity does not negotiate. And yet, the human mind rarely accepts tragedy at face value, especially when the person who fell seemed to be standing on solid ground just hours before. What unsettled people was not what the report said, but how little room they left for uncertainty. The story felt sealed before it had time to breathe. That finality created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured speculation. The video appeared quietly at first. Not in a press briefing or an official release, but in private messages, reposts, and fragments saved by strangers. It was short, blurry, filmed through a peephole that warped depth and distance. Anyone watching it could immediately tell what it was not. It was not clear. It was not definitive. It was not proof, but it was enough. In the clip, he moved down a narrow hallway under dim lighting. His posture did not match the image many associated with intoxication. He did not stagger. He did not lean against the wall. To some viewers, he looked escorted. To others, he simply looked tired. The footage did not answer questions. It multiplied them. Then there was the detail that refused to fade. A phone strap. Thin. Dark. Swaying slightly as the woman behind him held her device up. It was an object so common that it should have disappeared into the background. Instead, it became the foreground of the entire conversation. Screenshots froze it mid-swing. Circles and arrows appeared around it. Comparisons were made to photographs found online. The strap was matched, debated, and analyzed until it no longer belonged to the hallway at all. This was how suspicion took its first real shape. Not as a theory, but as an image. Human perception is not designed to sit comfortably with ambiguity. When confronted with incomplete information, the mind searches for patterns, even if it has to invent them. The strap offered something tangible, something visible. It gave uncertainty a physical form. People could point to it and say, "Look, that is where the story changes." Some dismissed it immediately. Accessories are mass-produced. Similar objects exist everywhere. Coincidence, they argued, was far more likely than conspiracy. Others disagreed just as firmly. In a world saturated with cameras and documentation, they asked, why did this one detail align so closely with images already known? Between those positions lay a vast middle ground of doubt. Not belief, not disbelief, just discomfort. The more the video circulated, the more it was dissected. Each replay seemed to reveal something new, though nothing had actually changed. The hallway felt narrower, the figures closer, the woman behind him more intentional, or perhaps less. The mind adjusted the scene according to the conclusion it wanted to reach. What made the situation more volatile was the absence of a clear counter-narrative. There was no extended explanation addressing the footage. No detailed breakdown of what the video showed or did not show. Instead, there was silence. And silence, in the age of constant commentary, feels deliberate, even when it is not. Silence invites projection. It allows observers to fill gaps with their own assumptions. For some, the lack of response suggested confidence that the truth would withstand scrutiny. For others, it felt like avoidance. Each interpretation reinforced itself through repetition, shared among communities that increasingly spoke only to those who already agreed. As the focus narrowed, the story shifted away from the fall itself. Gravity became secondary. Alcohol became background noise. The narrative centered on moments before impact. The hallway, the movement, the strap, the presence of others. These fragments began to feel more significant than the outcome, as if understanding the final minutes could retroactively change the ending. This is the point where accidents begin to lose their randomness in the public imagination. Tragedy, left unexplained to satisfaction, starts to look intentional even without evidence. People struggle to accept that a life can end without meaning, without a culprit, without a reason that feels proportional to the loss. The strap endured because it offered meaning. It suggested connection. It implied involvement. It transformed a solitary fall into a shared moment. Whether that implication was fair or factual mattered less than how powerfully it resonated. As days passed, the original clip became harder to find. Links expired. Posts disappeared. Copies survived in private folders and saved files. Each disappearance made the footage feel more dangerous, more forbidden, more important. The harder it was to access, the more authority it seemed to carry. By then, the narrative had already crossed a threshold. It was no longer about determining what happened. It was about deciding what felt true. The official explanation existed, unchanged. But alongside it grew another account, assembled from fragments and fueled by mistrust. From that moment on, the strap was no longer just an object. It became a question no one could unsee. As the focus narrowed around the video and its smallest details, attention shifted toward what followed next. Or more precisely, what did not. No immediate clarification. No direct response. No attempt to step into the noise and quiet it. In a story already shaped by absence, silence became the loudest element of all. In public crises, people expect motion, statements, appearances, denials or explanations that acknowledge the storm, even if they do not resolve it. Silence disrupts that expectation. It creates an emotional imbalance, especially when suspicion has already taken hold. Without words to anchor the narrative, interpretation rushes in to take their place. For some observers, the silence felt calculated. They read restraint where others saw fear. To them, every hour without a response looked like an admission. Not because evidence existed, but because the mind tends to equate confidence with visibility. When nothing is said, doubt fills the space where reassurance should be. Others viewed the silence differently. They argued that any response would have been twisted, dissected, and weaponized. In that view, saying nothing was the only way to avoid escalating the damage. A statement could be misquoted. A denial could be framed as defensive. Silence, at least, avoided adding fuel to speculation. Yet even this explanation failed to gain traction once public momentum had built. Silence does not remain neutral for long. It evolves. It absorbs meaning from those who observe it. As days passed, the absence of a voice became a canvas onto which countless narratives were projected. Each theory gained strength not from new facts, but from repetition. Posts echoed one another. Videos analyzed the same moments again and again. What began as questions hardened into assumptions. This is how an individual becomes a symbol. The woman in the hallway was no longer just a person captured in a blurry frame. She became a role, a placeholder for suspicion. Her identity, her intentions, even her character were reconstructed through fragments and guesswork. Online discussions spoke about her with certainty, despite the lack of verifiable evidence. Silence allowed those reconstructions to go unchallenged. Meanwhile, the man who fell receded further into the background. His life, his work, and his personality were gradually replaced by his final hours. The tragedy of his death became secondary to the mystery surrounding it. He was remembered less as a person and more as a catalyst, the event that triggered everything else. The imbalance was striking. One person could no longer speak because he was gone. The other chose not to speak, or perhaps could not. In the space between those two silences, A narrative flourished, unchecked. Psychologically, this pattern is familiar. Humans are deeply uncomfortable with unresolved endings. When an event lacks a clear emotional resolution, the mind seeks one elsewhere. Responsibility must be assigned. Meaning must be extracted. Without these, grief feels incomplete. Silence, instead of offering calm, intensifies the search. Every public appearance was scrutinized. Every absence was noted. Each decision not to comment became another data point in an imaginary case file assembled by strangers. The story gained weight not through confirmation, but through accumulation. Enough small suspicions, repeated often enough, begin to resemble certainty. At the same time, legal language emerged in the background. Words like defamation and false information circulated, not as explanations but as warnings. To some, these were signs of self-protection. To others, they were interpreted as attempts to intimidate. The reaction depended entirely on which version of the story one already believed. This division created two parallel realities. In one, there was caution, a refusal to engage with rumors, an understanding that silence does not equal guilt. In the other, silence was proof. The lack of denial was read as confirmation. Once these realities formed, they no longer interacted. Each side reinforced itself. What made the situation particularly volatile was that no new information arrived to disrupt either narrative. There was no definitive image to replace the blurry video. No testimony to override speculation. The absence of fresh facts allowed the story to loop endlessly around the same details, growing more distorted with each cycle. In this environment, truth became secondary to belief. What mattered was not what could be proven, but what felt consistent with the story people had already accepted. Silence, stripped of context, became a weapon used by both sides. One side used it to argue innocence. The other used it to argue concealment. The result was a kind of suspension. The case was closed in an official sense, but socially it remained wide open. The silence did not end the conversation. It ensured that it would never settle. Silence did not protect anyone. It only gave suspicion more room to breathe. By the time the official conclusion was reiterated, the story had already split in two. On paper, everything was settled. The fall was accidental. Alcohol impaired judgment. There was no evidence of struggle, no indication of criminal involvement. The language was firm, restrained, and definitive. It did what official conclusions are designed to do. It closed the file. But closure on paper does not guarantee closure in the human mind. Alongside the official verdict, another judgment had formed quietly and then all at once. This second verdict did not rely on reports or measurements. It was built from impressions, fragments, and emotions left unresolved. It did not claim certainty, yet it refused dismissal. In this version of events, something essential had been missed. Something important had been overlooked or ignored. Both verdicts existed simultaneously, each impervious to the other. For those who accepted the official explanation, the matter was tragic, but simple. A life ended too soon. A series of poor decisions met with unforgiving physics. They saw speculation as cruelty layered onto grief, an attempt to impose meaning where none existed. In their view, the story should have ended with sympathy, not suspicion. For others, acceptance felt like surrender. They argued that accidents rarely leave behind so many unanswered questions. They pointed to the hallway footage, the absence of clarity, the silence that followed. To them, believing the official version required ignoring intuition. and intuition once activated is difficult to silence. This division revealed something deeper than disagreement. It exposed how differently people understand justice. For some, justice is procedural. It exists in evidence, reports, and conclusions reached through formal processes. For others, justice is emotional. It demands a narrative that feels proportional to the loss. When those two forms of justice diverge, neither can fully satisfy. The tragedy deepened because no outcome offered relief. If the fall was truly an accident, then the questions haunting the public had no answers. There was no one to hold responsible. No explanation sufficient to ease the sense of waste. Randomness remained the final authority. For many, that was unbearable. If the fall was not an accident, then something far worse had occurred. Silence had protected it. Ambiguity had allowed it to persist. And the truth, whatever it was, had slipped beyond reach. That possibility was equally unsettling. In both scenarios, the result was the same. No one was freed from doubt. The man who died could no longer define his own story. His final hours became a canvas for competing interpretations. Each theory claimed to honor him, yet each pulled him further away from who he had been in life. His identity narrowed until it revolved almost entirely around how he died, not how he lived. The woman who remained became trapped in the opposite way. Alive, visible, and silent, she carried a burden that could not be proven or erased. In the absence of certainty, suspicion attached itself permanently. Even innocence, if it existed, had no clear path to restoration. Once a name becomes linked to a mystery, separation is rarely complete. What made this case especially haunting was the absence of a final revelation. There was no dramatic confession, no conclusive footage, no moment where all doubt collapsed into clarity. Instead, the story stalled, suspended between belief and disbelief. Over time, the conversation fractured. Some moved on, accepting the official account and allowing memory to soften. Others retreated into smaller spaces, preserving fragments of the story, like evidence waiting to be re-examined. The same images resurfaced again and again, not because they revealed something new, but because they refused to resolve into nothing. In this way, the case transformed into something closer to folklore than investigation. Details were repeated. Meanings shifted. Certainty grew without foundation. The original event became less important than the story built around it. This is the danger of unresolved tragedy. When facts fail to satisfy, belief takes over. When belief takes over, resolution becomes impossible. Each side guards its version of the truth, not to convince the other, but to preserve its own sense of coherence. The official verdict did what it could. It named an outcome. It offered an explanation. It closed the case. But it could not close the questions that had already taken root. In the end, no verdict erased the uncertainty. No conclusion restored balance. The story remained unfinished, not because of what was hidden, but because of what could not be reconciled. And so, the tragedy endured in two forms. One documented and final. The other restless, unresolved, and endlessly debated. In the end, no verdict could erase the question that had already taken root. Time has a way of softening most tragedies. Details fade. Emotions dull. Stories lose their urgency and settle into memory. But some cases resist that process. They remain sharp, unsettled, and emotionally unfinished, not because new evidence emerges, but because the original questions were never allowed to rest. This was one of those cases. Officially, nothing more remained to be said. The explanation stood unchanged. An accident. A fall. A life lost to a brief lapse in judgment. The file was closed, archived, and left behind. By every formal measure, the story had ended. Yet endings require acceptance, and acceptance was never unanimous. For many, the discomfort lingered not in what was stated, but in what felt absent. The lack of clarity around the final moments. The images that raised more questions than they answered. The silence that followed, interpreted and reinterpreted until it took on a life of its own. None of these elements proved wrongdoing. But together, they formed a narrative that refused to dissolve. In this unresolved space, memory hardened into belief. The man who died became more than a person. He became a symbol of fragility, of how quickly certainty can vanish. His final hours were replayed endlessly, not out of voyeurism, but out of a desire to understand. To locate meaning where randomness felt unacceptable. His legacy, once defined by talent and promise, became overshadowed by the mystery of how his story ended. At the same time, another figure remained fixed in the public imagination. Alive, visible, and forever linked to unanswered questions. Whether through coincidence or circumstance, her presence in the narrative could not be erased. Even without proof, association alone proved powerful enough to endure. In the absence of resolution, suspicion became permanent. This is the quiet cruelty of unresolved stories. They do not need conclusions to cause damage. They persist through implication alone. What makes such cases endure is not evidence, but emotion. The human need for coherence. The refusal to believe that tragedy can occur without intent. When reality offers no villain, the mind invents one. When answers fall short, belief steps in to fill the gap. And so, two truths continued to exist side by side. One was orderly, documented, and final. The other was emotional, fractured, and impossible to silence. Neither could fully erase the other. Neither could offer peace. In the end, perhaps the most unsettling aspect was not the fall itself, but what followed. The way a few blurred images, a common object, and an absence of words transformed grief into suspicion. The way silence, intended or not, became the loudest voice in the room. Some stories end with answers. Others end with acceptance. This one ended with neither. What remains is a cautionary echo. A reminder that in the age of constant observation, ambiguity is rarely tolerated. Silence is rarely forgiven. And once doubt takes root, it does not need proof to survive. The official verdict may have closed the case. But for those still watching, still questioning, still replaying the same fragments in search of clarity, the story never truly ended. Some verdicts are written in ink. Others are whispered, shared, and remembered. And sometimes, silence is the loudest verdict of all.